This evening we have our piracy panel. We had one 2 years ago. Not everybody is convinced. A lot has changed since then, so we're delighted to have the panelists with us this evening. You know Robbie Harris is the chairman of the board. Tonight he's Captain Harris, U.S. Navy retired, and he's going to take the role of one of the panelists. We all know we not all know, but we certainly think we have opinions about the problems of piracy, which we find to be puzzling. Fellows in small boats capture big boats, and the United States Navy and others with tremendous resources have trouble coping with the problem. And we look forward to being enlightened this evening about a most perplexing problem. Let me turn it over to, and let me say also that Robbie Harris is responsible for getting these good people together and for organizing the panel. Let me turn it over to him now. Captain Harris.
Well, Frank, thank you very much, and thanks to all of you for being here tonight. As Frank said, 2 years ago or so, I think it was 2 years ago, this panel visited the subject of piracy once before, and clearly enough, we didn't solve the problem then, so we're back to tackle it again tonight. Let me begin by introducing the panel members. To my far right is Ms. Donna Hopkins. Donna is from the State Department. She is the coordinator for Counter-Piracy and Maritime Security in the Department of State. She is responsible for coordinating all diplomatic efforts to combat piracy. Prior to this, 2003 to 2010, she headed the Plans and Policy Team in the Paul Mill Office at Plans, Policy, and Analysis in the Department of State. Before that, she was a Navy officer retiring with the grade of captain, and Donna was among the first women officers to be assigned to seagoing ships back in 1980, and she was assigned to several. In fact, she has sea legs that match most men who served in the Navy. Donna took her undergraduate degree at Rice University and a master's degree from the U.S. Naval War College, and that master's degree is with distinction from the U.S. Naval War College. We look forward to hearing Donna's comments tonight. Next is Dr. Whiteneck, seated to my right. Dan is the research analyst at the Center for Naval Analyses down in Alexandria, Virginia. Dan has been with the Center for Naval Analyses for 10 or so years. I may have that slightly wrong. Prior to joining the Center for Naval Analyses, he was a professor at the University of Colorado and also at the Air Force Academy. He's a glutton for punishment. He's had 3 tours in the Pentagon as a scientific advisor to admirals in the Pentagon on the Navy staff there. And much to his credit, he has deployed with 2 carrier strike groups, first for Operation Enduring Freedom. Those were the initial strikes into Afghanistan in 2001. And then later for Operation Iraqi Freedom, which was in 2003. I should point out that the Center for Naval Analyses is a FFRDC, a think tank that provides analytical services to the Department of Defense and particularly to the Navy. So they assign scholars, analysts to operate with the Navy and the Marine Corps, and Dan has been in the field as it were, actually at sea for both those important operations, OEF and OIF. Between Donna and Dan is Dr. Martin Murphy, who is, without exaggeration, an expert on the subject of piracy. In fact, if there is one go-to guy in Washington on the subject of piracy, it is Martin. Martin is the author of several books. His most recent one is Somalia, the New Barbary. And earlier than this, his masterful book entitled Small Boats, Weak States, Dirty Money, Piracy and Maritime Terrorism in the Modern World, which was published in 2009, which is an overview of his PhD dissertation. It is the prime reference I think most people find on this subject of piracy. Martin has published articles in a number of journals: the Naval War College Review, the U.S. Naval Institute Proceedings, Jane's Intelligence Review. He is a research fellow at Dalhousie University up in Halifax, Canada. He is a visiting fellow at the Corbett Center for Maritime Policy Studies at King's College, London. Martin took his BA degree at the University of Wales and his master's and doctorate from the University of Reading, studying under the noted scholar Colin Gray, who is one of the preeminent strategists of the past 50 years. So that's our panel. We will begin with Ms. Hopkins. Donna, it's yours.
Thank you, Robbie. Dr. Bird, trustees, and ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for having me tonight. I'm going to make some prepared remarks, and after the panelists are finished, I'll be pleased to take your questions. The safety of American citizens overseas is a top priority of the State Department. When pirates based in Somalia hijacked the U.S. sailing vessel Quest off the coast of Oman and brutally murdered 4 American crew members on February 22nd, it reminded us that despite all the very hard work we've done behind the scenes to build international cooperation to counter the growing phenomenon of Somali piracy, the problem is not yet under control. The number of ships attacked has continued to rise. The number of successful hijackings and the number of crew members held as hostage have increased. The length of times that ships and their crews are held has gotten longer, and the size of ransoms when paid has gotten larger and larger. While our political leadership and our military forces have taken this issue very seriously for a number of years now, the task of effectively patrolling the vast expanse of the Indian Ocean is formidable. And the problem demands more than military action, which is a necessary but not sufficient component of any successful counter-piracy strategy. We are taking a broader approach that includes the United States military as part of a greater coalition of forces to carry out counter-piracy missions throughout the Horn of Africa region in support of freedom of the seas. As a result of our efforts, we have arrested 28 suspected pirates who attacked U.S. vessels and brought them to the United States to be prosecuted for serious crimes carrying sentences of up to and including life in prison. Piracy is a serious foreign policy problem, which is why I'm here speaking to you this evening. Piracy emanating from Somalia is a problem for 3 reasons. First, piracy threatens maritime trade in a fragile and fractious part of the world, one seriously in need of immediate humanitarian assistance and ultimately of economic investment and sustainable development. Second, piracy is a transnational criminal enterprise that contributes to instability in a region where the governance is already weak. And third, piracy potentially threatens the flow of humanitarian aid, oil, gas, and other critical goods through a vulnerable strategic maritime bottleneck, risking the economic viability and, in some cases, the very survivability of key United States allies and friends. I wish to make 3 primary points this evening. First, the root cause of piracy in the Indian Ocean is state failure in Somalia. Second, naval response is necessary but not sufficient. It serves a critical need for safety on the high seas, but it will not end nor even dramatically curtail this species of piracy. While the United States military forces have done a superb job of conducting counter-piracy operations as part of a combined maritime force, we must find the means to disrupt the pirate enterprise that starts and primarily operates ashore, concentrating in particular on the financial flows that fuel and reward it as we continue efforts to help stabilize Somalia overall. Third, a coordinated and dynamic multi-sectoral response by the international community to contain and curtail piracy will be required for the foreseeable future. We need and welcome contributions from key flag states as well as industry to develop a full and effective response to piracy. Combating piracy emanated from the failed state of Somalia will require concentrated and coordinated assistance to the area, to states in the region, including parts of Somali society with which we can reasonably work, to build the capacity of regional states to deal effectively with the social, legal, economic, and operational challenges to effective maritime law enforcement. While piracy is an age-old problem, Somali piracy is a relatively new business model of organized extortion and kidnapping for ransom that occurs on a notable scale only in this particular location on the globe. The reasons for this are twofold. First, Somalia is, at least for now, the only failed state with a long coastline providing a safe haven along a densely trafficked and strategically critical waterway. Second, Somalia's geographical neighbors do not have the ability, either politically or militarily, to curtail piracy emanating from Somalia. It is worth noting that although the United States government is examining options for more aggressive military actions against pirates and their support infrastructure, current counter-piracy operations are carried out under a law enforcement framework. Piracy is a crime, and the objective of counter-piracy operations is to deter, disrupt, and prevent acts of piracy, including by apprehending and prosecuting suspected pirates and imprisoning those convicted. Recently, 10 Somali defendants pled guilty to piracy and other crimes in the Eastern District of Virginia for their roles in the hijacking of the Quest. They will now face up to life in prison. Even if we could justify military actions as a matter of international law and policy, targeting a few pirate bases is unlikely to change the calculus of a sizable body of unscrupulous people in Somalia who have much to gain and very little to lose by engaging in this particular high-profit criminal enterprise. While the political community grapples with the challenges of returning some kind of governance to Somalia, and the development community works to deliver humanitarian, social, and economic development assistance, the counter-piracy community has recognized 5 key areas that require dedicated effort and far more resources that are currently committed to this problem. The first is a combination of coordinated naval operations and collaborative regional capacity building. While maritime forces are working to deter, disrupt, and prevent acts of piracy, and this is a very important function, nations need to direct targeted assistance to countries in the region to improve their ability to respond to piracy operationally, judicially, and eventually with economic alternatives. We need to find a way to work more effectively with the Somalis themselves. The internal political dynamics of that fractured state have complicated the United States' efforts in providing security-related foreign assistance to the region. Second is expanding the legal and judicial options available to countries combating piracy, both for prosecution and incarceration. This may include the development of specialized piracy chambers within national courts in the region, as well as an increased willingness by countries to prosecute those pirates in their own national courts who attack their ships and their crews. Third is improving industry's compliance with best management practices, or BMPs, to prevent pirate boardings in the first place. When it comes to piracy, a good defense is far more effective than any kind of offense, and hijackings are now routinely avoided by timely action on the part of the vessel's masters and crews. But this is not as easy as it sounds. National governments and the commercial maritime industry are grappling with a range of complex policy, safety, and security issues arising from the increasing use of private armed security by commercial shipping. Under guidance from the United States Coast Guard, U.S.-flagged vessels transiting dangerous waters now implement vessel security plans that have been effective in preventing pirate hijackings. Internationally, shipping industry associations have communicated BMPs to their members, but compliance is not universal. Commercial shippers justifiably expect national navies to protect the sea lanes, but their expectations should be tempered by the reality of the enormous expanse of the Indian Ocean. Fourth is the need for expanded strategic communication efforts that make clear the damage that a relatively small number of criminals is doing, primarily to their own countrymen and their neighbors in Eastern Africa, to political recovery from decades of civil war, to regional development, and to the willingness of the international community to invest in sustainable enterprises that depend, as in all coastal nations, on maritime commerce. Social pressure from the many decent Somalis who object to the destructive activities of pirates who are corrupting their clan-based societies and their young people, and from the larger Somali diaspora who see the negative impact that piracy is having on Somali development and society, could be a significant factor if it were properly mobilized. Fifth, and most strategically important, we need to make a serious, concerted effort to disrupt the pirate enterprise by identifying the pirate leaders, tracking their sources of financing and supplies like fuel, outboard motors, and weapons, disrupting those support networks, and working with our allies to ensure that these leaders and facilitators of piracy are known to law enforcement officials in every country in which they do business. All of the foregoing lines of effort require close and effective international cooperation. The United States cannot do any of this unilaterally. We are constrained in our ability to operate in this part of the world by geography, history, culture, and resources. We can convene, we can contribute, and we can lead, but we cannot fix Somalia by ourselves, and we cannot end piracy alone. We simply must act in concert with the international community for the foreseeable future to control this particular outbreak of maritime cancer. To this end, we created a new architecture for international counter-piracy cooperation called the Contact Group for Piracy off the Coast of Somalia. The Contact Group has proven effective in harmonizing political counter-piracy policy among 70-plus nations, international organizations, and maritime trade associations. The Contact Group is actively supported by excellent leadership from a number of key partners, including the United Kingdom, Denmark, Egypt, Italy, and others, and operates in close coordination with multilateral institutions, including the United Nations, NATO, and the European Union. I will be happy to answer questions about the Contact Group following presentations by my fellow panelists. Thank you.
Donna, thank you very much. Martin Murphy.
Good evening. First of all, thank you very much to Robbie and to Mr. Bird for inviting us, and good evening to you all. I was surprised and delighted that there was quite a number of points of agreement with Donna. It's always a pleasure to say that.
Unusual, but fun.
Don't ruin it, Donna. What we're confronted here, we're dealing with the most extraordinary challenge to maritime good order and the peaceful use of the sea since the Second World War. As Donna mentioned, Somali pirates are unique in the modern era in that they make their money by ransoming the crew. So far, at least, they have no interest in the ship or its cargo, which has been the central interest of most pirates up until now. Until now, they ransomed the crew as a single package. Although there are now some concern that they might be beginning to split crew into several packages and demand ransoms for each one, and perhaps for the ship and the cargo as well. Doing this would complicate the ransom negotiations and will undoubtedly increase the size of their take. Pirates released a VLCC, a very large supertanker, the MV Irene, loaded with around $150 million of crude oil for somewhere between $13 and $14 million in February. But they received $7 million for 2 Spanish fishermen only recently. That was from a ship called the Vega 5. Now, There are special circumstances that attach to both these figures, so they should not assume that in themselves they represent a trend, but they do indicate some possible futures. So what can be done? There's much talk about the use of violence against pirates to increase the risks that they face by putting their own lives in jeopardy. Now, I have no objection to the increased use of violence, provided that it's deployed in the service of a policy that could either eliminate piracy or reduce it to manageable and acceptable levels. The use of increased violence on its own in the service of the current policy would not do that. The failure of the policy that has been adopted so far is nothing new, or rather, perhaps being a little more generous, the limited success of the current policy that the current policy has achieved is due to the political limitations placed upon it, and that is nothing new when viewed historically. People who say how brutally and effectively piracy was dealt with in the past forget how long pirates had been operating, in many cases for years and even decades, before states took action against them. In each and every case, the motivation for that action was political considerations larger than piracy. Piracy's political significance has always exceeded its economic impact. Time after time, it's been observed that it can take time for that significance to become apparent. Or put it another way, as was put in a conference that Donna and I were at last week, the cost of doing little is currently less for states than the cost of doing something. When that cost increases, it will at some stage reach a level that states find unacceptable. This is the point at which they will take action, but I would warrant that the trigger will not be piracy alone, but will be some larger breakdown in order. In the meanwhile, states are happy to do what they've often done: transfer the cost of piracy to the private sector in terms of higher insurance premiums, unfunded risks, increased ship protection measures, private security hires, higher labour costs, and the human toll on seafarers. And of course, ransoms, which are now nudging towards an average of $5 million per ship and crew package. But Somali piracy, just like so many other outbreaks of piracy, does present states with strategic risks, the US most of all. What we're seeing is the deployment of military force in the absence of clear and realistic policy objectives. The strategic risks of continuing down this chosen path, I would argue, are twofold. First, concerns about how the Navy and through the Navy how US power is perceived. As Sun Tzu said, it is always better to win wars without fighting them. Now that piracy affects, not that piracy affects US power directly, pirates have only rarely had that sort of power, and usually only for relatively brief periods. The suggestion is that competitors circle the dominant power continuously looking for weaknesses, and over time leverage those weaknesses wider and wider. The US, like it or not, and I believe it should like it, is the ultimate guarantor of maritime trade and the peaceful use of the global maritime commons. I repeat, the Somali pirates are the most substantial threat to that freedom that has emerged since the Second World War. And if the Navy is unable to guarantee that peaceful use because the policy it serves is flawed, then it will create openings that other powers will gradually fill. Piracy suppression has always provided states with a useful excuse for aggrandizement. The way I read it is that that is happening already. The Navy talks about unprecedented levels of cooperation out on the water, but I cannot believe that piracy suppression is the only reason the navies of states such as China, India, and Russia are there. It is certainly not the only reason why the European Union is there. Second point, piracy is a distraction from the larger problem of state failure and disorder throughout the Horn of Africa region. We've got a potential zone of instability from Yemen to Kenya, which can be exploited by Muslim extremism. The continuing and worsening problems in Yemen are seriously worrying. There's a continuing reluctance to bolster stable areas within Somalia, effectively concedes the initiative to an enemy potentially more substantial than pirates. Any response requires engagement with the problem on land. It needs to be layered. It needs to involve a mixture of carrots and sticks. The new focus on tracking pirate finance and the interests of financiers should have been initiated earlier and needs to be pursued with great vigor. The effectively autonomous northeastern region of Puntland is the epicenter of Somali piracy. It's 1/3 of Somalia's land area and includes over a quarter of Somalia's domestic population. Piracy is now its second most significant source of finance after remittances from the Somali diaspora. The current political leadership in Puntland is ambivalent about piracy suppression, and that's to put it charitably. This needs to be changed, although I will be the first to concede that this is not easy, but then the important things rarely are. Given the degree to which piracy has distorted Puntland's already fragile economy, alternatives need to be nurtured. Ports, livestock exports, fishing, oil and gas, minerals. We can facilitate those, and we're not talking about aid here, we can facilitate those by the development of roads and the exploitation of water resources and all that goes with that. It's not our business to pay Puntlanders to stop being pirates, but it is in our interest to do a deal that encourages local enterprise and brings the pirate money that has gone overseas back to where it came from. Finally, it is in our interest to do a deal that encourages local responsibility, because the evidence that Puntland piracy connections are becoming more sophisticated and international, that perhaps not all the ships hijacked were simply found, but that some were meant to be found. Whenever piracy occurs, insurance fraud is never far behind. The risk of piracy and attendant crime is becoming endemic and therefore harder and harder to eradicate. Piracy is crowding out the alternatives to its success, directly and indirectly through inflation, and rebuilding them will take more time and cost more money. One thing that we have learnt from Afghanistan is that allowing disorder to fester in geostrategically important areas is in none of our interests. Thank you.
And Dr. Whiteneck, before Dan begins, let me point out, since I failed to mention his education before, that Dan took his bachelor's degree and master's degree from the University of California at Cal State in Sacramento, and his PhD from the University of Washington. Dan.
Thank you, Robbie. Thank you to Captain Harris and to Mr. Byrd and the entire council for the invitation to speak tonight. Let me preface my remarks by the fact that this is not a statement from the Navy or Center of Naval Analysis. This is one analyst who's been out there since about 2005 in a number of contexts. Was my first trip to the Horn of Africa, taking a look at this problem, and like it or not, I've had to live with it for the past 6 years. I'd like to talk a lot tonight about the issue of the operational and tactical side of this piracy contest that we see here. And it helps to think of it in terms of an offense and defense. Right now, the pirates you can think of as being on offense. They have objectives they want to accomplish. They are, as Donna said and Martin agreed, a very skilled group of transnational, international criminals. They are opportunistic. They are very much operationally and tactically adaptive. Sorry, get that. Lean over enough. They are decentralized to the point that it's difficult to take out a pirate camp and say, well, I've taken out the leader of the pack. It's an easy to start business. At the operational, at the lower level, You show up with weapons, a couple guys who are skilled at going to sea are able to pilot boats, and you're able to take a small dhow and a mothership, you're in business. With a little financing from, as Donna noted, a group of Somali criminals and pirates who are used to running cot, guns, and smuggling human beings, as well as piracy. The one thing the pirates have is they're dependent upon a safe haven. It's a weakness. It's their center of gravity. As long as they have human shields, as long as they have a place to take them and hold them hostage, then they are able to survive. If you look at piracy in other parts of the world, they get on ships, they commit maritime robbery, and then they leave. They do not take the people, they do not take the ship. Only where they have a place to hold it for months and months and get a ransom can they do that. On the other side of the game are a set of defenses by the shippers, the merchants, and the navies. Think of the shippers as being in point defense. They are trying to protect a particular unit, a spot, which is their ship. And they're about at the limits of their capabilities. Over 80% of the ships now practice best maritime practices that go through this region, that check in with the International Shipping Center in Djibouti. Over 20% of these ships, and according to latest reports, now have embarked security teams on them. That's the limit of their capabilities. Once they put an armed security team on board, how much further do we want them to go? On the other side of the defense is a set of naval forces that we can think of as cops on the beat. They rove, they move around, they don't sit in one spot. They patrol the straits coming out of the Gulf of Aden, and they shepherd people through there. And waiting at the end of that period of where they shepherd people through, guess what, are pirates who know that the naval patrols only go so far before they turn around and go back. So they're about at the limits of their capabilities. They're subject to political whims and the winds of time, and they do not have enough capacity to win, given the current strategy. But they stay in the game and they chalk up victories one by one. The implications of this is that it's very difficult to see a way where there is a escape from this frozen conflict. We rely on the shippers more and more, as Donna said, and the shippers go spend more and more money on it, and they've been able to have some successes, but they still get ships taken, especially at the lower end. We have many whole-of-government efforts which have been ineffective in stopping piracy. They have stopped individual pirates, and they have stopped pirate action groups, but they haven't stopped the entire enterprise. We are ineffective, along with all the other countries that are involved, but we're ineffective together. So we feel better about that. The bottom line is the pirates have been able to survive with acceptable losses. So they lose a few people to prison. It's pretty easy to recruit when there's a civil war going on and everybody starts shooting at each other at age 14. The shipping costs are not enough for the shippers to stop traffic. Shippers keep shipping oil and other goods through this region because the costs are spread throughout insurance costs to many, many shippers, and they're able to survive. The navies and the governments find that it's not important enough to really do something to stop the enterprise of piracy. But it's important enough to do something when there's a shock to the system. Think of piracy as background noise. And when 4 Americans are slaughtered in full view of U.S. Navy ships, the noise goes up. 2 weeks later, the noise has gone back down, and everybody's back at work, and the media is on to something else. When a Danish family is captured and 13-year-old girls are held, because their family A probably shouldn't have thought about sailing through this area in a yacht. But isn't that blaming the victim when we've said, please sail through international waters and we, the navies of the world, keep them safe? So it only breaches those points once or twice, and then we're right back to background noise. So where do we go from here? The pirates have the initiative. They are able to change their tactics. They are able to say, I want more money for hostages, as Martin pointed out. It is very interesting that the Spanish guys were involved in the fishing industry, which many Somalis use as strategic communications victory to say, look, the Europeans are stealing our fish. Of course we're into piracy. Stop stealing our fish and we'll stop getting into piracy. Ignoring the fact that Somali piracy dates back to the earliest cases we can find, or at least I can find, 1672. So apparently it's a long family business along with fishing. They can change the targets they aim. What happens if they really start taking more and more oil tankers? Then things get a little interesting. So what do the navies and the shippers do when a Somali pirate group outguns an embarked security team? That's the operational and tactical nightmare that everybody faces. Because at that point, the shippers turn around and say, I've had people killed in a gunfight with pirates, and the Navy didn't come rescue the ship. What happens when the citadel that the shippers built on the ship, which has communications and engine control in it, does not protect their crew because the pirates were able to shoot an RPG down the passageway, a rocket-propelled grenade, and blow a door in the citadel, or burn through it with a welding torch or plastic explosives? All of those have been tried. So what do we do from here? So what are the options? Let me give you a few options to where we go. For the pirates, you can look to see more pirate action groups. We've arrested 1,000 of them around the world. We've put them on trial. We've thrown them in jail. The Somali pirates put in jail in South Korea asked for asylum in South Korea. The jail in South Korea is preferable to shooting in Somalia to some people. They will have more motherships coming out with more hostages on them as human shields. They can expand their area of operations. We've seen now piracy move up into the Red Sea. Okay? They can change the way they deal with crews. They can get more hostages. We surround them, tell them to stop. Don't take that ship. They're face to face with the Seychelles Coast Guard, and they shoot one of the hostages and say, let us go, or the other 25 get it. What's one hostage when you have 20? So that's a change in the game. That's a game changer. How are we going to respond to that? What are the red lines that will make governments and navies and shippers change their behavior? For the defense, we have just about exhausted everything short of the use of force on land in Somalia. We have taken down 12 motherships in the last 2 months. We have shot at the pirates. We have taken them back. And that's not just the United States. That is navies from South Korea, Indonesia, Russia, India, Finland. Okay? When a small Finnish ship is able to take down the pirates, we have to ask ourselves, how aggressive are we being? I hate to be outgunned by the Finns. Especially a Finnish minesweeper. It's really difficult. Makes my head hurt. So if you're already shooting at the motherships and you're shooting at the skiffs that the pirates use, the high-speed skiffs, how much further can you go on the scale of escalation? So how do we think about outside the box thinking? Where do we go from here? Number one, we could walk away from the mission. There are no Americans held hostage. 0. There are no American flagged ships held hostage. 0. We could walk away. Because if you look back at international relations, what gives countries the power to interdict in these cases, aside from a call for rescue, is you have hostages, you have cargo, or you have a ship that's flagged in your country. So you do a rescue. Number 2, we can maintain the status quo. We can keep on being ineffective. And that's where we're headed. We're continuing that line very well. We will have individual successes, but we will not stop piracy as an enterprise. We'll be successful against individual pirates. Third, you could do something to the pirate camps. This has great risk. Strategic communications risk, international diplomacy risk. I'm sure Donna has been made aware of more than once in every conference she goes to. It has tremendous risk for the success rate, for what you want to accomplish. If only there was a song to remember this by. If only we had a history, a lesson that you could learn of dealing with African states, a coastal environment that took pirates, where Navy ships sailed out with people on them who went on shore and stomped on pirate camps. If people could remember this in some sort of song and maybe sing it at the alma mater over and over again every year, from the halls of, where was that place? To the shores of, anyway. But that's a model. How do you want to do this? Those are your three options. There is no other choice. If 4 Americans are held hostage, you have 2 choices. Your choices are, number 1, they're going to make it to the coast and you're going to negotiate with them for a year, like the British couple, and get them out. Number 2, you're going to attack the ship, try to rescue the hostages, and guess what? People are going to die. Some pirates, maybe some of the guys who try the rescue, Marines or SEALs, maybe some of the hostages. Those are your options. So far, we haven't found option 3. I would leave you with 3 conclusions. Number 1, for 400 years, we practiced counter-piracy by model number 3. Not just the United States, but the countries of the world. We have turned that upside down in the last 5 years. I don't know how effective that's going to be in the next 5 years, but I don't think it's going to be increasingly effective. Number 2, for 400 years, we worked very, very hard to make sure that the only people who used force on the global commons and the high seas were navies, sovereign states. Merchants carried cargo. It was peaceful. It was globalization. It was trade. It was the peaceful relations of nations. They didn't shoot. We worked very hard to stop privateering, mercenaries, letters of marque, all of that stuff. Now we're telling merchants, arm your ships and shoot back and defend yourselves and fight, because the navies won't be there. And they won't in the future. Capacity building is a mirage. There are 20-something ships on a daily basis from NATO, the EU, the United States, and other countries out there patrolling. Do you really think that the local regional nations are going to amass 25 or 40 or 50 ocean-going ships that are able to pursue pirates for years? From Kenya, Tanzania, Djibouti, Eritrea, Yemen, Oman. It's not going to happen for decades. And we've just turned it over to the private shippers. That's 400 years of history overturned in a couple years. That's an important point we should think about. Lastly, I will leave you with the words of a German shipper, which sum it all up. We interviewed him, and he said, "Why am I paying for taxes for a Navy and providing for my own self-defense?" That should send a chill up the spines of every single naval officer who hears it, not just a German. Because if you're not fighting pirates and you're a Navy, you've got a real problem on strategic communications. As I told Robbie's group when we were speaking there, Donna's heard this before, and so has Martin, my mother-in-law in a town of 600 people in Idaho knows, hey, Navies kill pirates, right? I saw it in a book, in a movie. You guys do this, right? So why am I watching it happen? That's a tough one, and we're going to have to find a way around it. And right now, we don't operationally, tactically, are on the right track at all to do it. Thank you very much. I look forward to your questions.
Dan, thank you very much. Dan's presentation is always like a splash of cold water in the face. And I will plant a question already for you, and this has happened before. How do we answer Dan's mother's question? And let's come back to that. First, I have to offer 2 disclaimers or caveats. First, most of you know that and Frank mentioned it, I am the chairman of the board of the Baltimore Council, and some of you know that my employer is Lockheed Martin Corporation. What I'm about to say does not necessarily reflect the views of Lockheed Martin, nor the views of the Baltimore Council. Now, whose views are these? I must tell you that when this panel was convened 2 or 3 weeks ago down in Washington, a close friend of ours presented these views that I am about to present. They are contrary to much of what you've heard so far, and I offer them for the sake of enlivening the discussion just a bit. So here goes. I will make 6 points, and here is the first one. There is a quote that's often attributed to President Thomas Jefferson that goes something like this: "Millions for defense, but not a penny for tribute," or tribute. It's completely untrue. Those words were not initially spoken by Thomas Jefferson. Rather, they were first spoken by Charles Pinckney in connection with the XYZ affair in 1798, when John Adams was the President of the United States, and this was after the sovereign country of France had taken roughly 300 U.S. merchant ships and demanded tribute. That quote comes from Pinckney, not from Thomas Jefferson. Okay, I'm going to offer you a couple of data points as I go through this. And the first data point is that contrary to the hand-wringing of pessimists, the U.S. economy has not hollowed out. We remain the world's largest manufacturer. I'm going to say that again. We remain the world's largest manufacturer. Now, you say, but that manufacturing employment has declined. Well, manufacturing deployment has declined. That's because we've become much more efficient. Productivity has increased. We do more with fewer people. But the U.S. remains the largest manufacturer in the world. Now, we are the third exporter in the world, behind first China and Germany. But that's because our domestic market is so large. Our domestic market is so large that we don't have to export a lot. Indeed, only 1% of U.S. manufacturers even consider international trade at all. That is data point number one, and point number one. Point number two, U.S. international commerce actually moves through the Somalia Basin only in very small numbers. Only 13% of U.S. oil imports move through that region or come out of the Persian Gulf. Only 13%. And of that 13% that comes out of the Persian Gulf, most of it doesn't go through the Red Sea and the Suez Canal at all. Rather, it goes around the Cape of Good Hope, i.e. around the southern tip of South America. The shippers do that not because they're pirates, because it's the more economical route to take to get the oil back to the U.S. So very, very little of our oil comes from the Persian Gulf and is subject to the piracy threat. Another data point. Oil markets do not even register a blip when a large tanker is taken hostage by one of the pirates. Not even registers a blip. Okay, remember this. Asia is our largest trading partner. Most of our commerce, other than oil, comes from Asia. And that commerce comes through the west coast of the United States, nowhere close to Somalia and nowhere close to the pirates that operate from Somalia. I'll also point out that most of the U.S. commerce in the region of Somalia also travels in ships that are too large and too fast to be vulnerable to pirate attacks. Now, the last point here on this one is that Europe, of course, is our next largest trading partner, and our trade that comes from Europe is nowhere close to Somalia and therefore is not vulnerable. Point number three, not only is U.S. foreign commerce not under threat from piracy, the actual threat to U.S. flagships is almost nil. The threat to U.S. flagships is almost nil. Why is that? It's because there are so few U.S. flagships left in the merchant marine today. Somewhere like only 2% of U.S. trade travels under a U.S. flag. Only 2% travels under a U.S. flag. Another data point, and this picks up on a point that Dan just made. The Somali pirates have hijacked exactly 0 U.S. flagships. The Somali pirates have hijacked exactly 0 U.S. flagships. Now, the pirates who took the sailing yacht on April 14th and killed the 4 Americans, that was a yacht. That was not a merchant ship. Until April of this year, only 1 U.S. merchant seaman has been held captive in the entire span of the Somali pirate activity. And no ransom of any sort has ever been paid for any American merchant seaman to any of the Somali pirates. Point number 4. The Somali pirates do not in any way impact U.S. foreign commerce. They do not directly cost the U.S. economy a cent, nor do they directly threaten U.S. seamen. The Somali pirates are irrelevant, at least with respect to U.S. commerce. Point number 5. Moving to the global system, the Somali pirates have almost no impact. In the global system, the Somali pirates have almost no impact. They have actually, according to the International Maritime Bureau, during the year 2009, 48 ships, 48 ships out of roughly 33,000, or 1/10 of 1%, that passed through the Somali area were attacked successfully by the pirates. That's a pretty small percentage. Data point. Somali pirates fail in their attacks most of the time. They have a success rate of roughly 25%. Roughly 25%. Now, lastly, point number 6, and the final point, and to a question I'm sure that is central to our discussion tonight. And that question is this: given that the Somali pirates have such a small impact, almost none, on the U.S. economy and U.S. trade, what is the U.S. national interest here that justifies the expense of keeping U.S. naval ships active in the anti-piracy mission? And this is the question we have to answer for Dan's mother out in Idaho. Well, one can argue that the U.S. has a large role and a large responsibility in maintaining the international system. After all, we, the United States, largely wrote the rules for the international system, and we benefit greatly by those. However, the real issue in Somalia is stability, or the lack of stability. And remember, and I think Donna made this point, Martin made this point, and Dan made this point, piracy is not the problem. Piracy is a symptom of that problem. The problem is instability ashore in Somalia. Piracy is a symptom of that problem. Now, I grant you, and I agree with Donna, that the international community has a role to play here. And I would argue that that role must be focused ashore, and that ships at sea, Navy ships, either U.S. or others, have only a small role to play in attacking that fundamental issue of instability ashore in Somalia. Okay, that's what I wanted to say. I think we have 25 minutes for Q's and A's. If you will, please, and now I'm going to do the Frank Bird thing tonight, and namely, I'm going to repeat your question. However, unlike Frank, I'm hearing challenged. So you're going to have to speak up, so come on up, ma'am, And you are the first. Great question. What is the relationship between piracy and terrorism?
I think we probably all agree that it's anecdotal and accidental and not deliberate and systemic. There are criminal organizations that operate in the same space, and it's inevitable that they will overlap, but they have very different motivations and modus operandi. And we don't think that there's any really systemic, deliberate linkages between the two.
I'd absolutely agree that there might be some leakage from the pirates to Al-Shabaab, but as Donna says, it is going to be accidental, it's going to be through family connections, it's going to be through clan connections. It's not systematic. It might even be related ship to ship and the relationship between the clan leader and the pirate, and it is not something that you're seeing a regular stream of income or a substantial stream of income going to the Islamists.
The question from the gentleman, and he comments on, first on my point that the cost to the U.S. is negligible. And he says, but what about the ransom that is paid? Let's see, Dan, you want to cover that one?
Sure. Pirate ransoms over the last year have totaled somewhere between $100 and $150 million. These are criminal enterprises. What does it finance? It finances, think of a criminal gang. It just builds to the next thing you're going to do. You plow it back into the business. It finances gun running, cot running, human smuggling, more piracy. It finances better motors. It finances a nice house. Finances for the young guys. Let's take a beginning pirate, 18 years old. You did a good job. You brought down a ship and you get a share of the ransom. He makes about $20,000 or $25,000 maybe out of that. That's about 50 years of income in Somalia. Wives, goats, SUV, house, take care of the clan, You've now provided for your family and your extended family, which is important in Somalia. The clan matters, and you have become somebody of importance. That $150 million buys a lot in Somalia. And you scatter it around. Some of it goes to Kenya. You drive it across the border to Nairobi. You can get the latest villas and SUVs. You can put it. It's the only business where money falls out of the sky. It's delivered ransom. You drop the plastic container out of a Cessna or a helicopter onto the ship. When the pirates get the money, leave the ship, go back on the coast, that's when they let the ship go. And the money is divided up and split up in cash, $3–4 million. The investors, you got to pay the bribes to the government officials. You got to pay the restaurant guy who supplied the food to the hostages for 6 months. You've got Filipino restaurants in Haradera, Somalia, supplying food for Filipinos who are held hostage, who are merchant mariners. You got to pay them. So 50–60% off the top for bribery and paying for support. It's not that much. It's a tough life.
I'd like to thank the panel for very informative and occasionally a splash of cold water in the face for your making us smarter. Thank you.